Sarah Martinez thought she was invisible. For 3 months, she had walked the halls of Mercy General Hospital like a ghost, enduring whispered jokes about the quiet new nurse who barely spoke above a whisper. Her colleagues rolled their eyes when she volunteered for the hardest shifts. They smirked when she stayed late to comfort patients. They had no idea that the soft-spoken woman organizing medication charts had once saved lives under enemy fire in Afghanistan. But on one ordinary Tuesday morning, when the sound of rotor blades cut through the city air and a Navy helicopter touched down in the hospital parking lot, everything Sarah had hidden was about to come to light. The Navy SEALs on that aircraft weren't there for a routine visit. They were there for her. And in the next few hours, the same colleagues who had dismissed her would discover that the quiet nurse they had ridiculed was actually Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, one of the most decorated combat medics in Navy SEAL history. Sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us in silence, waiting for the moment when their true strength is needed most. This is the story of that moment, and how one woman's hidden past changed everything for everyone around her. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast their usual harsh glow across the emergency department as Sarah Martinez finished her third double shift of the week. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and exhaustion lined her gentle features. At 28, she looked younger than her years, especially when she kept her voice soft and her eyes downcast as she moved between patients with the quiet efficiency that had become her trademark. "There goes Mouse Martinez again," whispered Jennifer Chun, one of the senior nurses, as Sarah passed the nurse's station carrying fresh linens. The nickname had stuck since Sarah's first week 3 months ago, when Dr. Richard Hoffman had loudly asked if anyone had actually heard the new nurse speak above a whisper. Sarah pretended not to hear the snickering that followed. She had learned long ago that sometimes being invisible was safer than being seen. These people looked at her and saw a timid young woman who had somehow landed a job at one of the city's busiest trauma centers despite seeming afraid of her own shadow. They didn't know that she chose to be quiet, that she deliberately made herself small, that every soft-spoken word and downcast glance was a carefully constructed defense mechanism. The emergency department of Mercy General was a war zone of a different kind than what Sarah was used to. Instead of desert heat and the constant threat of enemy fire, she faced the chaos of car accidents, heart attacks, and weekend violence that poured through the automatic doors 24 hours a day. The stress was familiar, but the dynamics were entirely different. Here, hierarchy was established through loudness, through who could make the quickest decisions under pressure, through who could command attention in a room full of competing egos. Sarah excelled at the medical aspects of her job. Her patient assessments were thorough and accurate. Her procedures were flawless, and she had an intuitive sense for what each patient needed that impressed even the most seasoned doctors. But she did all of this quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to herself. When Dr. Marcus Webb complimented her technique during a particularly difficult fore insertion on a dehydrated elderly patient, she simply nodded and moved on to the next task. "Thank you, doctor," she had said in her characteristic soft voice, her eyes focused on her hands as she disposed of the needle and documented the procedure. Dr. Webb had looked puzzled by her subdued response to praise, but Sarah was already walking away, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound against the polished linoleum floor. The truth was that Sarah Martinez was hiding in plain sight. Every morning when she tied her long dark hair back and pinned her hospital ID badge to her scrubs, she was putting on more than just a uniform. She was stepping into a carefully crafted identity that bore almost no resemblance to the person she had been for the previous 8 years of her life. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, Navy SEAL combat medic, had officially died 6 months ago in the mountains of Afghanistan. Not literally. She had completed her final deployment and processed out of the military with full honors and a chest full of medals that now sat in a box in her small apartment. But the woman who had earned those medals, who had crawled through enemy fire to reach wounded teammates, who had performed emergency surgery in the back of a moving helicopter while under attack. That woman had been carefully packed away along with her dress blues and combat gear. In her place stood Sarah, the civilian nurse, Sarah, the quiet newcomer, Sarah who jumped slightly when doctors raised their voices, and who seemed to struggle with the confidence that the job demanded. It was an elaborate performance, one that she had perfected over months of practice, and one that served a very specific purpose. She needed to disappear to become someone completely different from the person she had been, because the alternative was dealing with questions she wasn't ready to answer and attention she didn't want to receive. The problem with being a decorated combat veteran in civilian life was that people either treated you like a hero or like a victim, and Sarah didn't want to be seen as either. She had seen too many former service members struggle with the transition, watched them become defined entirely by their military service or their struggles to adapt to civilian life. She had decided early on that she would rather be seen as unremarkable than be viewed through the lens of her military experience. So when her colleagues at Mercy General looked at her, they saw exactly what she wanted them to see. They saw a young woman who had probably gone straight from nursing school to this job, who had never faced anything more challenging than a difficult patient or a misdiagnosis. They saw someone who needed protection rather than someone who had spent years providing it to others under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Martinez, room 7, needs a blood pressure check, called out charge nurse Patricia Williams, her voice carrying the edge of irritation that seemed to be permanently attached to any request directed at Sarah. Patricia was a 30-year veteran of emergency medicine who ruled the department with an iron fist wrapped in floral scrubs. She had made it clear from Sarah's first day that she considered the new nurse to be deadweight, someone who had probably gotten the job through connections rather than qualifications. The fact that Sarah's nursing skills were actually exceptional only seemed to irritate Patricia more, as if competence without the accompanying confidence was somehow an insult to the profession. "Right away, ma'am," Sarah replied, grabbing the blood pressure cuff and making her way to room 7. The patient was an elderly man who had been brought in after a fall at home. His adult daughter sat beside the bed, worry etched across her features as she held her father's weathered hand. Sarah approached quietly, introducing herself in her characteristic soft voice as she wrapped the cuff around the patient's arm. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Peterson?" she asked, her voice gentle but clear. "Been better, sweetie," the old man replied, wincing slightly as Sarah inflated the cuff. "This ticker of mine isn't what it used to be." As Sarah listened to the steady rhythm through her stethoscope, she noticed something that the previous assessments had missed. The patient's pulse was irregular in a way that suggested more than just the stress of his fall. She could hear the telltale skip of atrial fibrillation, a condition that would require immediate attention and could explain why he had fallen in the first place. In her military days, Sarah would have immediately called for the attending physician and clearly communicated her findings with the confidence that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. But Sarah, the civilian nurse, hesitated, second-guessing herself despite her extensive experience with cardiac issues in combat situations where heart monitors and EKGs weren't always available. "Dr. Webb," she said quietly as the attending physician passed by the room. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Dr. Webb paused, looking slightly surprised that the quiet nurse had initiated a conversation. "What is it, Martinez?" "I think Mr. Peterson might be an AFib," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His pulse is irregular, and given his history and the circumstances of his fall." Dr. Webb moved into the room and conducted his own examination, listening carefully to the patient's heart rhythm. After a few moments, he straightened up with a look of impressed surprise. "Good catch, Martinez," he said. "Let's get him on the monitor and start him on anticoagulation therapy." As Dr. Webb began writing orders, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction of a correct diagnosis, but she pushed the feeling down. She couldn't allow herself to take pride in her medical skills the way she once had. Pride led to confidence, and confidence led to questions about how someone so young and apparently inexperienced could be so good at reading subtle symptoms and making accurate assessments. The daughter squeezed her father's hand as Sarah began setting up the heart monitor. "Thank you, nurse," she said, tears of relief in her eyes. "I was so worried when he fell. I thought we might lose him." Sarah smiled softly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes because she was working so hard to keep her emotions contained. "He's going to be fine," she said quietly. "Dr. Webb is excellent, and we'll take good care of him." As she worked to attach the monitor leads, Sarah's hands moved with a precision and confidence that seemed at odds with her timid demeanor. Her fingers were steady and sure as she placed each electrode in exactly the right position, and she had the monitor reading properly within seconds. It was the kind of efficiency that came from having performed similar procedures hundreds of times under much more challenging conditions. But none of her colleagues were paying close enough attention to notice the disconnect. Back at the nurse's station, Patricia Williams was reviewing patient charts with Dr. Hoffman when Dr. Webb approached them. "That new nurse, Martinez, just caught something we all missed on the Peterson case," Dr. Webb said, settling into a chair with his coffee. "Patient came in after a fall, and she picked up on AFib that we might have overlooked for hours." Dr. Hoffman looked up from his paperwork with surprise. "Really? Mouse Martinez? Don't call her that, Richard," Dr. Webb said with mild reproach. "She's actually quite good. Quiet, but she knows what she's doing." Patricia frowned, glancing across the department where Sarah was quietly documenting her patient care notes. "She's timid as a church mouse," Patricia said dismissively. "Lucky guess, probably. These new grads sometimes get one right by accident." Dr. Webb shrugged, returning to his own paperwork. "Maybe, but her assessment was spot on, and her technique is flawless. Might want to give her more credit." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Sarah had heard enough of it to know that her careful performance was working exactly as intended. They saw her success as luck rather than skill, her competence as accidental rather than earned. It should have been frustrating, but instead it was exactly what she needed. The last thing she wanted was for anyone to start asking questions about where she had developed her medical skills or why someone fresh out of nursing school could read cardiac rhythms like a seasoned emergency physician. As her shift continued, Sarah moved through the department like a ghost, caring for patients with quiet efficiency while her colleagues continued to treat her as an afterthought. She administered medications with perfect technique, comforted worried families with gentle words, and assisted in procedures with a competence that no one seemed to notice because it came wrapped in such unassuming packaging. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a sandwich while scrolling through news on her phone. Most of the articles were the usual mix of politics and celebrity gossip, but one headline caught her attention. "Navy SEAL team returns from classified mission in eastern Afghanistan." Sarah's hands tightened around her phone as she read the brief article. The details were sparse, as they always were with special operations missions, but she recognized some of the terminology and could read between the lines about what kind of operation it had been. More importantly, she recognized the unit designation. It was her old team, the men she had served with for 3 deployments, the brothers who had watched her back through countless dangerous missions. For a moment, the careful wall she had built around her emotions threatened to crumble. She could almost hear Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez's laugh, could picture Petty Officer First Class David Chin's concentrated expression during mission briefings, could feel the camaraderie that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her military service. These are the people who knew who she really was, who had seen her at her best and her worst, who would never understand why she was hiding in a civilian hospital pretending to be someone she wasn't. Sarah closed the article and put her phone away, forcing herself to take slow, steady breaths until the emotion passed. This was exactly why she had chosen to disappear, why she had deliberately severed contact with her military life and everyone in it. The bonds formed in combat were too strong, the memories too vivid, the contrast between who she had been and who she was pretending to be too stark. When she returned to the emergency department, Sarah threw herself back into her work with renewed determination to maintain her cover. She responded to every request with quiet compliance, assisted with every procedure without drawing attention to her skills, and continued to be the invisible nurse that everyone expected her to be. But as the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to notice something that made her instincts, honed by years of military service, begin to prickle with unease. There were more security guards than usual moving through the hospital, and they seemed to be conducting some kind of coordinated sweep of the building. Their movements were too purposeful to be routine, too systematic to be random. When she passed the main information desk, she overheard a fragment of conversation between two guards that made her blood run cold. Federal agents asking about former military personnel, specifically combat veterans, working in medical positions. Sarah forced herself to keep walking, to maintain her calm demeanor, but inside her mind was racing. There were only a few reasons why federal agents would be looking for former military medical personnel, and none of them were good. Either someone was in trouble, or someone was being recruited for something dangerous, or she stopped that line of thinking before it could go any further. Whatever was happening, it had nothing to do with her. Sarah Martinez, the quiet nurse, had no military background, no combat experience, no reason to attract federal attention. She had made sure of that when she created this new identity. But as she returned to her patient care responsibilities, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to collide with the military past she had worked so hard to leave behind. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in a place she had tried to lock away, Lieutenant Commander Martinez was stirring, responding to signs of potential danger with the alertness that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat operations. The quiet nurse continued her rounds, but beneath the surface, the warrior was waking up. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that reminded Sarah of mountain mornings in Afghanistan, though she quickly pushed that thought away as she walked through the hospital's main entrance. Her shift didn't start for another hour, but she had developed the habit of arriving early to review patient charts and prepare for the day ahead. It was a routine that helped her maintain the careful balance between competence and invisibility that had become her survival strategy. The emergency department was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning, with only a few patients in the waiting area and the overnight staff looking forward to the end of their shift. Sarah settled at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee and began reviewing the cases that had come in during the night. As she read through the charts, she noticed several patterns that would have been invisible to most civilian medical personnel, but were obvious to someone with her background. 3 separate patients had been admitted with injuries consistent with blast trauma, though they were all documented as victims of a construction accident. Their injuries showed the characteristic pattern of pressure waves and fragmentation that Sarah had seen countless times in combat zones. More telling was the way their vital signs had been documented, the careful notation of neurological responses, and the specific attention paid to potential internal bleeding suggested that whoever had treated them knew exactly what to look for in blast victims. Sarah's instincts, sharpened by years of military service, began sending warning signals. Construction accidents could certainly cause serious injuries, but these specific patterns, combined with the federal agents she had overheard yesterday, suggested something more complex was happening. Morning, Martinez called Patricia Williams as she arrived for the day's shift. "You're here early again. Don't tell me you actually enjoy this place." "Just wanted to review the overnight cases," Sarah replied in her characteristic soft voice, closing the charts and moving away from the station as other staff members began arriving. Dr. Hoffman appeared a few minutes later, looking more serious than usual as he gathered the day's shift for morning briefing. "Listen up, everyone," he announced. "We got some unusual circumstances today. There are federal agents in the building conducting interviews with selected staff members. If you're called for an interview, cooperate fully and answer their questions honestly." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but she forced herself to maintain her calm exterior. Around her, the other nurses and doctors were murmuring among themselves, speculating about what kind of investigation would bring federal agents to a hospital. "What kind of interviews?" asked Dr. Webb, voicing the question that everyone was thinking. "Security clearance verification," Dr. Hoffman replied. "Apparently, they're conducting background checks on personnel with certain qualifications. That's all I've been told. Security clearance verification meant only one thing. Someone was being considered for a position that required federal clearance, or someone with existing clearance was being investigated. Sarah had maintained her top-secret clearance even after leaving the military, partly out of habit and partly because she had never gotten around to having it officially revoked. If the agents were here about clearances, they would eventually get to her, and her carefully constructed civilian identity would crumble under even basic scrutiny. As the briefing broke up and staff dispersed to their assignments, Sarah noticed that she was not among the first group called for interviews. That could mean they weren't interested in her, or it could mean they were saving her for last. Given her growing suspicion that her past was catching up with her, she suspected it was the latter. The morning progressed with unusual tension underlying the normal chaos of emergency medicine. Federal agents in dark suits moved through the hospital corridors, conducting their interviews in a conference room that had been commandeered for their use. Sarah could see them through the glass walls, serious-faced men and women with the bearing of people accustomed to dealing with classified information and dangerous situations. Around noon, Sarah was caring for a young construction worker who had been brought in with injuries from the previous night's accident when she overheard a conversation that confirmed her worst fears. The Martinez woman, one of the agents was saying to Dr. Hoffman near the nurse's station. "We'll need to speak with her this afternoon." "Sarah Martinez?" Dr. Hoffman replied. "She's one of our newer nurses. Very quiet, competent, but not particularly standout. Is there something specific you need to know about her?" "Just routine verification," the agent said, but Sarah caught the subtle tension in his voice that suggested it was anything but routine. Sarah finished caring for her patient and excused herself to the supply room, where she could think without being observed. Her mind raced through possibilities and options, but none of them were good. If federal agents wanted to interview her about her background, they already knew more than they were letting on. The question was whether they knew everything or just enough to be suspicious. She thought about the construction workers with blast injuries, about the sudden appearance of federal agents, about the security sweep she had noticed the previous day. The pieces were forming a pattern that suggested something significant was happening, something that required the involvement of someone with her specific skills and experience. The problem was that using those skills, even acknowledging that she possessed them, would destroy the civilian identity she had worked so hard to create. But if she was already blown, if the agents already knew who she really was, then continuing to pretend might only make things worse. Sarah's internal debate was interrupted by Jennifer Chin's voice calling for her from the main department. "Martinez, you're needed in trauma too. Multiple GSW coming in, ETA 5 minutes. Multiple gunshot wounds meant all hands on deck, and despite her desire to avoid attention, Sarah couldn't ignore a medical emergency. She made her way to the trauma bay, where the overnight team was preparing for the incoming ambulances. Dr. Webb was leading the trauma response, with Patricia Williams coordinating the nursing staff. "What do we know?" Dr. Webb asked as the first ambulance arrived. 3 victims, all GSW to the chest and abdomen, reported the paramedic as they wheeled in the first patient. "This one's the worst. Lost a lot of blood, pulses thready, blood pressure dropping fast." Sarah took one look at the patient and immediately recognized the severity of the situation. The man was young, probably military age, with the kind of physical conditioning that suggested active duty or recent discharge. His injuries were consistent with high-velocity rounds, and his presentation indicated massive internal bleeding that would require immediate surgical intervention. As the trauma team sprang into action, Sarah found herself moving with automatic efficiency that had nothing to do with her civilian training and everything to do with her military experience. She had seen these exact injuries dozens of times in combat zones, had learned to recognize the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in the critical first minutes of treatment. "He needs 2 large-bore IVs and type-specific blood," Sarah said, her voice suddenly clear and authoritative as she began inserting 4 lines with practiced precision. Dr. Webb looked up in surprise at the change in her demeanor, but he was too focused on saving the patient's life to question it. Good call, Martinez. Get him typed and cross-match for 6 units. Sarah's hands moved with the kind of speed and accuracy that came from years of performing similar procedures under fire. She had the IVs inserted and running before most of the team had finished their initial assessment, and her technique was so smooth that Dr. Webb actually paused to watch her work. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, noting the military precision of her movements. For a split second, Sarah hesitated. In that moment, she could have deflected the question, made some excuse about her nursing training, and maintained her cover. But the patient on the table was dying, and her instincts told her that standard civilian trauma protocols weren't going to be enough to save him. "Afghanistan," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the trauma bay stop and look at her. The revelation hung in the air for a moment before Dr. Webb recovered his composure. "How many tours?" he asked, his tone now carrying a new level of respect. "3," Sarah replied, her focus entirely on the patient as she monitored his vital signs and adjusted fluid resuscitation rates. 8 years total attached to special operations units. The transformation in the trauma bay was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, Sarah wasn't the quiet, timid nurse who barely spoke above a whisper. She was a combat veteran with extensive battlefield medical experience, and her colleagues could see the difference in everything from her posture to the way she moved around the patient. "Talk to me about his presentation, Dr. Webb said, recognizing that he had someone with specialized trauma experience on his team. Sarah's assessment was rapid and thorough, delivered in the clear, concise language of military medical reporting. High-velocity GSW to the right chest with probable hemothorax. Second wound to the left upper quadrant suggests liver involvement. Blood pressure and pulse indicate class 3 hemorrhage, probably from hepatic laceration. He needs immediate surgical intervention and possibly damage control resuscitation protocols." Dr. Webb nodded grimly. "We're standing by. Can you stay with him during transport?" "Of course," Sarah replied, her military training taking over completely as she prepared the patient for transfer to surgery. As they moved toward the elevator, Sarah noticed that the federal agents had appeared at the edge of the trauma bay, watching the proceedings with intense interest. Their presence confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. The shooting victims weren't random casualties, and her involvement in their care wasn't going to go unnoticed. In the elevator, Dr. Webb studied Sarah with new eyes. "Special operations, you said. What was your designation?" Sarah hesitated again, but the pretense was already shattered beyond repair. "Hospital corpsman, attached to Naval Special Warfare Units. Combat médic." "Navy SEALs," Dr. Webb said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." The elevator reached the surgical floor, and they transferred the patient to the ER team. Sarah provided a detailed briefing to the surgical team, her report delivered with the kind of precision and clinical detachment that came from years of similar handoffs in much more challenging circumstances. As they returned to the emergency department, Dr. Webb was quiet for several minutes before speaking. "Why didn't you tell us about your background when you started here?" Sarah looked down at her hands, which still showed the steady confidence that had emerged during the trauma. "Because I wanted to be normal," she said quietly. "I wanted to be just another nurse, not the former combat medic who everyone treats differently because of what she's seen and done." And now, Sarah thought about the federal agents waiting for her, about the pattern of injuries she had been seeing, about the careful civilian identity that was now in ruins. Now I think normal wasn't really an option. When they returned to the emergency department, the atmosphere had changed noticeably. Word of Sarah's military background had spread through the department, and her colleagues were looking at her with a mixture of surprise, respect, and curiosity. Patricia Williams approached her with an expression that was equal parts embarrassed and impressed. "Martinez," Patricia said, struggling to find the right words. "I owe you an apology." I had no idea about your background. Sarah managed a small smile. It's okay, Patricia. I didn't want you to know. But why? With your experience, you could have been in charge of trauma from day one. Why pretend to be inexperienced? Timid? Because I've been responsible for life and death decisions for 8 years straight, Sarah said, her voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there before. I wanted to see if I could do this job without carrying that weight, without everyone looking at me and seeing either a hero or a victim. Before Patricia could respond, one of the federal agents approached them. He was tall and serious-looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and his presence immediately commanded attention from everyone in the vicinity. Ms. Martinez, he said, his voice professional but not unfriendly. I'm Agent Robert Harrison, FBI. I'd like to speak with you when you have a moment. Sarah nodded, knowing that the moment she had been dreading had finally arrived. I can speak now, Agent Harrison. As they walked toward the conference room, Sarah was aware of her colleagues watching her with new interest. The quiet, invisible nurse was gone forever, replaced by Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, combat veteran, whether she wanted it or not. Agent Harrison closed the door behind them and gestured for Sarah to sit. First, let me say that this interview is not adversarial. You're not in any trouble, and you're not under investigation for any wrongdoing. Sarah relaxed slightly, but remained cautious. Then what is this about? Your country needs your help, Agent Harrison said simply. There's a situation developing that requires someone with your specific skills and experience. Someone who understands both advanced trauma medicine and special operations protocols. I'm not active duty anymore, Sarah said. I'm just a civilian nurse now. Agent Harrison smiled slightly. After what I just witnessed in that trauma bay, I don't think just applies to anything you do, Lieutenant Commander Martinez. The use of her military rank sent a jolt through Sarah's system. It had been months since anyone had called her anything other than Martinez or nurse, and hearing her rank spoken aloud brought back a flood of memories and emotions she had been working hard to suppress. What kind of situation? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The kind that involves American personnel in hostile territory, the kind that requires immediate medical intervention under combat conditions, and the kind that can't wait for official channels and standard procedures. Agent Harrison opened a folder and placed several photographs on the table. Sarah recognized them immediately. They were surveillance photos of the construction workers who had been treated the previous night, but the images showed them in military gear rather than civilian clothes. These men are part of a classified operation that went sideways, Agent Harrison explained. They're stranded in a situation where conventional medical evacuation isn't possible, and they need someone who can reach them and provide advanced trauma care under hostile conditions. Sarah studied the photographs, her military training automatically assessing the tactical situation and the likely medical challenges involved. Why me? There are plenty of active duty corpsmen who could handle this. Because this operation requires someone who officially doesn't exist, Agent Harrison said. Someone who can work outside normal military channels, someone with the skills to handle the medical aspects and the experience to operate in a special operations environment. A deniable asset, Sarah said, understanding the implications immediately. Exactly. If things go wrong, officially you're just a civilian nurse who was never involved in any government operation. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, weighing the implications of what Agent Harrison was proposing. Taking on this mission would mean abandoning the civilian identity she had worked so hard to create, stepping back into the world of classified operations and mortal danger that she had deliberately left behind. But it would also mean using her skills to save American lives, something she had devoted 8 years of her life to doing. And if the men in those photographs were who she thought they might be, if they were from her old unit, how long do I have to decide? She asked. The helicopter is already on standby, Agent Harrison replied. We need an answer in the next hour. As Sarah sat in the conference room, staring at the photographs of wounded soldiers who might be her former teammates, she realized that her carefully constructed civilian life had been an illusion from the beginning. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez had never really retired, She had just been waiting for the next mission to begin. Agent Harrison left Sarah alone in the conference room with the photographs and a secure phone, giving her 30 minutes to make a decision that would change everything. Through the glass walls, she could see her colleagues in the emergency department going about their normal routines, completely unaware that one of their own was being asked to step back into a world they couldn't imagine. Sarah picked up the first photograph and studied it carefully. The man in the image was wearing civilian clothes in what appeared to be a hospital bed, but she could see the telltale signs of someone accustomed to military discipline in his posture and bearing. More importantly, she could see the specific pattern of his injuries, blast trauma combined with gunshot wounds that suggested an ambush scenario, the kind of tactical situation that special operations teams sometimes found themselves in when missions went wrong. The second photograph showed another wounded man, this one with facial injuries that had been carefully treated, but still showed the devastating effects of close-quarters combat. Sarah had seen similar injuries before, usually the result of explosive devices or grenades used in confined spaces. The medical care he had received was competent but basic, suggesting field treatment rather than hospital-level intervention. But it was the third photograph that made Sarah's blood run cold. The man in the image was unconscious, hooked up to various monitoring equipment, and his injuries were extensive enough to suggest that he was in critical condition. More importantly, despite the facial swelling and bandages, Sarah recognized him. Petty Officer First Class David Chun had been her teammate for 2 deployments, a communications specialist whose calm competence under fire had saved their unit more times than she could count. He was also one of the few people in her military life who had understood her decision to leave the service, who had respected her need to find a different path forward after 8 years of combat operations. Seeing David's battered face in the photograph brought back a flood of memories that Sarah had been working hard to suppress. She remembered the time he had carried her to safety after she had been wounded while treating casualties during a firefight in Helmand Province. She remembered late-night conversations in forward operating bases where they had talked about what they would do when their military service was over. She remembered the goodbye they had said 6 months ago when she processed out, when she had promised to stay in touch and then deliberately hadn't. Sarah reached for the secure phone Agent Harrison had left with her, knowing that once she made this call, there would be no going back to her civilian life. The number was already programmed in. All she had to do was press the call button and speak to whoever answered. Before she could change her mind, she pressed the button. Secure line answered a voice that she didn't recognize, but that carried the crisp professionalism of military communications. "This is Lieutenant Commander Martinez," Sarah said, surprised by how naturally her old rank came back to her. "I'm calling regarding the extraction mission." "Stand by for a briefing, officer," the voice replied, and Sarah was put on hold for several seconds before another voice came on the line. "Sarah? Jesus Christ, is that really you?" The voice belonged to Master Chief Petty Officer James Rodriguez, her old team leader and one of the few people in the world who could make her smile just by speaking her name. Rodriguez had been her mentor, her protector, and in many ways the closest thing to a father figure she had known since joining the Navy. "Hello, Chief," Sarah said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent for months. "I heard you boys got yourselves into trouble." "Nothing we can't handle," Rodriguez replied, but Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. "Problem is, we've got wounded who need more help than we can provide in the field, and official channels are compromised. We need someone who can get in, patch up our people, and get out without leaving any fingerprints." "How bad are they?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer based on the photographs. "Chen's the worst. Blast concussion, possible internal bleeding, and he's been unconscious for 18 hours. The other 2 are stable, but need surgical intervention that we can't provide here. We got maybe 24 hours before Chen's condition becomes irreversible." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. David Chun was dying, and she was probably the only person who could save him. But accepting this mission meant abandoning the civilian life she had fought so hard to build, stepping back into a world of violence and danger that she had deliberately left behind. "What's the tactical situation?" she asked, her military training taking over despite her reservations. "We're in a safe house about 60 miles north of the Pakistani border," Rodriguez explained. "The area is nominally friendly, but there are hostile elements in the vicinity, and we can't risk a conventional medical evacuation without compromising the larger operation." "Larger operation? Can't discuss that on this channel, even a secure one. But let's just say that what we're doing here is important enough that Washington is willing to bend a lot of rules to make sure it succeeds." Sarah understood the implication immediately. Whatever Rodriguez and his team were involved in, it was classified at the highest levels and probably involved national security interests that went far beyond a simple special operations mission. "How would I get in?" she asked, committing herself to the mission even as part of her mind rebelled against the decision. "Navy helicopter will take you to a forward staging area. Then you'll go in with a small security team. Medical supplies and equipment will be provided, but you'll be working with limited resources under potentially hostile conditions." It was exactly the kind of mission Sarah had performed dozens of times during her active duty years, but this time she would be going in as a civilian contractor rather than as military personnel. If something went wrong, if she was captured or killed, there would be no official acknowledgement of her involvement, no military funeral, no recognition of her sacrifice. "Chief," Sarah said quietly, "you know I left all this behind for a reason." "I know, kid," Rodriguez replied, his voice gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "And if there was any other way to handle this, we wouldn't be asking. But David is dying, and you're the only one who can save him." The weight of that statement settled over Sarah like a physical presence. David Chun had saved her life more than once during their deployments together. He had been there during some of the darkest moments of her military career, had helped her through the trauma and loss that came with combat operations, had been a true friend when friendship was the difference between survival and breakdown. She owed him her life several times over, and now he needed her to return the favor. "I'll do it," Sarah said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "When do I leave?" "Helicopter will be at Mercy General in 90 minutes, Rodriguez said. "Pack light, bring only essential personal items. Everything else will be provided." "Chief," Sarah said before he could disconnect the call, "how did you find me?" Rodriguez chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. "Sarah, you're one of the most decorated combat medics in SEAL history. Did you really think the Navy was going to lose track of you just because you moved to civilian life?" The call ended, leaving Sarah alone in the conference room with the photographs and the weight of her decision. In 90 minutes, she would be leaving behind Sarah Martinez, the civilian nurse, and returning to Lieutenant Commander Martinez, combat medic and special operations veteran. She gathered the photographs and walked back into the emergency department, where Agent Harrison was waiting near the nurse's station. Her colleagues were still going about their routines, but she could see them glancing in her direction with new interest and curiosity. "I'm going," Sarah told Agent Harrison quietly. He nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Your supervisor has been briefed. Officially, you're taking emergency family leave for an indefinite period. Your position here will be held for when you return." "If I return," Sarah corrected. "You'll return," Agent Harrison said with confidence. "People like you always do." Sarah made her way to the locker room, where she kept her personal belongings, her mind already shifting into the tactical mindset that had sustained her through 8 years of dangerous missions. She changed out of her scrubs and into civilian clothes that would be appropriate for travel, then gathered the few personal items she wanted to take with her. As she was packing, Patricia Williams appeared in the doorway of the locker room. "Martinez," Patricia said, her voice uncertain. "I mean, Lieutenant Commander Martinez. I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you. If I'd known about your background." "You treated me exactly like I wanted to be treated," Sarah said, not unkindly. "I worked very hard to be invisible, Patricia. You were just responding to what I was showing you." "But why? Why hide something like that?" Sarah finished packing and turned to face the woman who had been her supervisor for 3 months. Because being a combat veteran isn't just something you did, it's something you are forever. And sometimes you want to find out if there's anything else left of who you used to be underneath all that training and experience. And what did you find out? Patricia asked. Sarah smiled sadly. That some things you can't leave behind, no matter how hard you try. As Sarah walked through the emergency department one last time, she was aware of her colleagues watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect to something approaching awe. Dr. Webb caught her eye and nodded, a gesture that conveyed both support and understanding. Dr. Hoffman looked confused, but impressed, as if he was still trying to reconcile the quiet nurse he had known with the decorated combat veteran she had revealed herself to be. Agent Harrison escorted her to the hospital's helipad, where a Navy helicopter was already waiting. The aircraft was an MH-60S Seahawk, the same type she had flown on countless times during her active duty years, and seeing it brought back a rush of memories, both good and bad. The flight crew was professional but friendly, greeting her with the easy camaraderie of people who understood the nature of their shared mission. As the helicopter lifted off from the hospital roof, Sarah looked down at Mercy General growing smaller below them and wondered if she would ever see it again. But as they flew toward whatever awaited her, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that went beyond her individual needs and desires. David Chun was dying, and she was the only one who could save him. Rodriguez and his team were in danger, and she had the skills to help them complete their mission. For the first time since leaving the military, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez was exactly where she needed to be. The helicopter banked toward the east, carrying her away from her civilian life and back toward the world she had tried so hard to leave behind. In the distance, another aircraft was approaching Mercy General Hospital, the same hospital where her colleagues were still processing the revelation that their quiet, invisible nurse had been hiding one of the most impressive military records any of them had ever encountered. The transformation was complete. Sarah Martinez, civilian nurse, was gone. In her place sat Lieutenant Commander Martinez, combat medic, ready to undertake one final mission for the teammates who had never stopped, depending on her skills and courage. The forward staging area was a temporary facility set up in an abandoned warehouse 30 miles from the Pakistani border, the kind of improvised command center that special operations forces could establish and tear down within hours. Sarah had been in dozens of similar facilities during her active duty years, but walking into this one felt different. She was no longer official military personnel, no longer protected by the formal structure and support systems that came with active duty status. Master Chief Rodriguez was waiting for her when the helicopter touched down, and seeing him in person for the first time in 6 months brought a flood of conflicting emotions. He looked older than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes and a weariness that suggested the past months had been hard on him and his team. "Sarah," he said, embracing her briefly before stepping back to look at her with the critical eye of an experienced combat leader. "You look good. Civilian life been treating you well." "Until about 6 hours ago," Sarah replied, accepting the tactical gear and medical equipment that his team had assembled for her. "How long has David been unconscious?" 22 hours now," Rodriguez said, his expression grim. "We've been able to maintain his vital signs and keep him stable, but he needs more than field medicine can provide." Sarah examined the medical supplies that had been prepared for her, noting that they had managed to acquire surgical-grade equipment and medications that weren't normally available in field conditions. Someone with serious resources and influence had put this package together, which confirmed her suspicion that this mission involved more than just a routine special operations rescue. "What's the tactical situation at the safe house?" she asked, checking the functionality of a portable ultrasound machine that would be essential for assessing internal injuries. 2-story building in a rural area, approximately 40 hostile fighters in the general vicinity, but no immediate threat to the location. Local security is provided by friendly assets, but We can't count on that lasting if the opposition figures out where we are. Rodriguez led her to a table where aerial photographs and tactical maps were spread out, showing the route they would take to reach the safe house and the contingency plans for extraction if things went wrong. Insertion will be by helicopter to a landing zone approximately 2 miles from the target building, he explained. Security team of 4 will accompany you to the location, provide perimeter security while you work on the wounded, then escort you back to the extraction point. Sarah studied the maps and photographs, her military training automatically identifying potential threats and escape routes. The terrain was mountainous and sparsely populated, offering good concealment, but limited options for rapid evacuation if they came under attack. What's the estimated time on target? She asked. 6 hours minimum, Rodriguez replied. David's condition is complicated, and the other 2 wounded need surgical procedures that can't be rushed. 6 hours was a long time to maintain security in hostile territory, especially if the opposition had any idea where they were. Sarah had been in similar situations before, working to save lives while gunfire erupted around her, but never as a civilian contractor without the backup and support that came with official military status. Chief, she said quietly, what aren't you telling me about this mission? Rodriguez was quiet for several moments before responding. The operation that went sideways wasn't just a routine special operations mission. David's team was gathering intelligence on a terrorist cell that's planning something significant, something that could affect American lives on a scale we haven't seen since September 11th. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about saving the lives of 3 wounded soldiers. The intelligence they had gathered was critical to national security, and completing their mission could prevent a major terrorist attack on American soil. The wounded soldiers have information that we need, Rodriguez continued. David specifically has details about the timing and target of the planned attack. He's the only one who made direct contact with the terrorist leadership, and that information is locked in his head. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders. Saving David's life wasn't just a matter of loyalty to a former teammate. It was potentially the key to preventing hundreds or thousands of American casualties. How long do we have before the intelligence becomes useless? She asked. Intelligence analysts believe the attack is planned for sometime in the next 10 days, Rodriguez said. But without the specific details that David obtained, we won't be able to prevent it. The mission parameters were now clear. Sarah had to save David's life and get him conscious and coherent enough to provide the intelligence that could prevent a major terrorist attack. The margin for error was essentially zero, and failure would mean consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Let's go, Sarah said, shouldering her medical pack and checking the functionality of her communication equipment. The flight to the insertion point took 45 minutes, during which Sarah reviewed the medical files of all 3 wounded soldiers and mentally prepared for the procedure she would need to perform. David's condition was the most serious, traumatic brain injury combined with possible internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention under field conditions. The helicopter touched down in a rocky clearing surrounded by scrub brush and low hills, and Sarah's security team moved with the practiced efficiency of experienced special operations personnel. They established a perimeter around the landing zone while Sarah and her medical equipment were unloaded, then began the 2-mile hike to the safe house. The terrain was rough, and the pace was fast, but Sarah's military conditioning came back quickly as they moved through the darkness toward their objective. The security team leader, a Navy SEAL named Petty Officer First Class Jackson, maintained constant communication with the safe house and provided regular updates on their progress. Safe house in sight, Jackson reported as they crested a low ridge and saw the building below them. No signs of hostile activity, perimeter security in place. The safe house was a traditional stone building that had been reinforced with sandbags and defensive positions, the kind of structure that special operations forces often use for temporary bases in hostile territory. As they approached the building, Sarah could see sentries posted at strategic locations and movement inside that suggested a significant number of personnel. They were met at the entrance by Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, David's team leader, and someone Sarah remembered from her active duty years. Torres looked exhausted and stressed, the expression of a leader who was watching his men suffer without being able to provide adequate help. "Thank God you're here," Torres said, leading her immediately toward the makeshift medical facility that had been set up in what had originally been the building's main room. David's been unconscious for over 24 hours now, and his condition has been deteriorating for the past 6 hours. Sarah's first sight of David Chun since her arrival made her stomach clench with concern. He was unconscious and connected to basic life support equipment, his face pale and swollen from his injuries. The blast trauma was evident in the pattern of cuts and bruises on his head and upper body, and his vital signs indicated possible intracranial pressure that could be life-threatening if not addressed immediately. "What's his Glasgow coma scale?" Sarah asked, beginning her assessment of David's neurological status. 7 when we first got him here, down to 5 over the past few hours, Torres replied. "We've been trying to maintain his airway and keep his blood pressure stable, but we don't have the equipment or expertise to do much more than that." A Glasgow coma scale of 5 indicated severe brain injury, with a poor prognosis if not treated aggressively. Sarah knew that David had minutes rather than hours before his condition became irreversible, assuming it hadn't already reached that point. "I need to perform emergency surgery to relieve intracranial pressure," Sarah said, beginning to set up the surgical equipment she had brought with her. "It's going to be risky under these conditions, but it's his only chance." "What do you need from us?" Torres asked. "Clear the room except for essential personnel. Give me the best lighting you can manage, and be ready to move him to the extraction point as soon as I'm finished," Sarah said, her hands already moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed similar procedures under combat conditions. As the security team established a tighter perimeter around the building and non-essential personnel moved to other areas, Sarah began the delicate process of preparing David for emergency neurosurgery. She had performed similar procedures before, but never under these specific circumstances, never with so much depending on her success. The portable ultrasound confirmed her suspicions about intracranial bleeding, showing a hematoma that was putting pressure on David's brain and threatening to cause permanent damage or death. The surgery she needed to perform was technically complex and normally required a fully equipped operating room, but she had improvised under worse conditions during her military service. "David," she said quietly as she began the procedure, "you better not die on me. We got work to do." For the next 3 hours, Sarah worked with the kind of focused intensity that blocked out everything except the immediate medical crisis in front of her. The surgery was complicated by the field conditions and limited equipment, but her years of combat medicine experience allowed her to adapt and improvise when necessary. Halfway through the procedure, gunfire erupted outside the building as the security perimeter came under attack from hostile forces who had apparently discovered their location. Sarah barely looked up from her patient as bullets struck the stone walls, and her security team returned fire with automatic weapons. "How much longer?" Jackson called from his position near the window. "At least another hour," Sarah replied, not pausing in her work despite the chaos around her. "I can't stop now, or he dies." The firefight continued for 20 minutes before the attackers withdrew, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they returned with reinforcements. She had to complete the surgery and get David stable enough for evacuation before the next assault began. As dawn approached, Sarah finally stepped back from the makeshift operating table where David lay unconscious but stable. The surgery had been successful. The intracranial pressure had been relieved, and his vital signs were improving. More importantly, his neurological responses suggested that he would regain consciousness within the next few hours. "He's going to make it," Sarah said, exhaustion evident in her voice as she began preparing David for transport. "But we need to get him to a real hospital as soon as possible for follow-up care." As if on cue, the sound of rotors filled the air outside the building, signaling the arrival of the extraction helicopter. Sarah and the security team worked quickly to prepare all 3 wounded soldiers for transport, with David requiring the most careful handling due to his recent surgery. As they carried David toward the helicopter, his eyes opened for the first time in over 24 hours. He looked confused and disoriented, but when his gaze focused on Sarah's face, he managed a weak smile. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the rotors. "What are you doing here?" "Saving your stubborn life," Sarah replied, tears of relief running down her face as she helped load him onto the helicopter. "We'll talk more when you're feeling better." As the helicopter lifted off from the safe house and headed toward the forward medical facility, Sarah realized that she had successfully completed the most challenging mission of her career, military or civilian. David Chun was alive and would recover, the intelligence mission could be completed, and a terrorist attack would be prevented. But more importantly, she had rediscovered something about herself that months of civilian life had obscured. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez wasn't just a part of her past. She was an integral part of who she was, and hiding from that identity had been a mistake that could have cost lives. As they flew towards safety, Sarah knew that her time as an invisible civilian nurse was over. But she also knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the confidence and purpose that came from finally accepting all aspects of her identity, both the warrior and the healer. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the same conference room at Mercy General Hospital where Agent Harrison had first approached her, but everything had changed. The woman who had once hidden behind downcast eyes and whispered responses now carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally stopped running from her own identity. The debriefing had taken 3 days at a secure facility outside Washington, where David Chun had provided the intelligence that led to the disruption of a planned terrorist attack on multiple American cities. The operation had been classified at the highest levels, and officially, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez had never left her civilian nursing position at Mercy General Hospital. But the people who knew her at the hospital were about to discover that the quiet nurse who had disappeared on emergency family leave was returning as someone entirely different. Dr. Marcus Webb was waiting for her in the conference room along with Patricia Williams and Dr. Richard Hoffman. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to concern, and Sarah could see that word of her military background had spread through the hospital during her absence. "Sarah," Dr. Webb said, standing as she entered the room, "it's good to have you back. How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in months," Sarah replied honestly, taking a seat at the conference table with a confidence that would have been unthinkable just 2 weeks earlier. "Dr. Hoffman cleared his throat, clearly struggling with how to address the situation. "Sarah, we need to discuss your position here at the hospital. Your background changes things significantly, and we want to make sure we're utilizing your skills appropriately." Sarah had expected this conversation and had spent considerable time during the debriefing thinking about what she wanted to do with her future. The mission to save David Chun had reminded her of who she really was, but it had also shown her that she could integrate her military experience with her desire to help people in civilian life. "I'd like to propose something," Sarah said, pulling out a folder containing documents she had prepared during her time in Washington. "I want to establish a trauma training program here at Mercy General, specifically focused on combat casualty care and mass casualty events." The 3 administrators looked at each other with surprise, clearly not having expected such a comprehensive proposal. "Explain," Patricia said, leaning forward with interest. "My experience overseas taught me that civilian medical personnel often lack the specific training needed to handle certain types of trauma," Sarah explained. "Blast injuries, gunshot wounds, mass casualty scenarios. These are becoming more common in civilian settings, but most hospital staff haven't been trained to handle them effectively." Sarah opened the folder and distributed copies of her proposal to each of them. "I want to create a program that trains emergency department staff in combat casualty care techniques, teaches them to work effectively under extreme stress, and prepares them for scenarios that traditional medical training doesn't cover. Dr. Webb was reading through the proposal with growing excitement. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "After what happened with those construction workers last month, it became clear that we weren't as prepared as we should be for certain types of trauma." "The construction workers who were really military personnel," Patricia said, putting the pieces together. Sarah smiled. "I can neither confirm nor deny that, but I can say that the injuries I've seen in civilian settings often mirror what I dealt with in military environments. The techniques and protocols that kept people alive in Afghanistan and Iraq can save lives here at home too." Dr. Hoffman was studying the budget projections and staffing requirements outlined in Sarah's proposal. "This would require significant resources and administrative support," he said. "But given the current security environment and the types of incidents we're seeing in major cities, it might be worth the investment." "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I've been approached by federal agencies about serving as a consultant for medical personnel training. They want someone who understands both civilian medicine and military operations to help bridge the gap between the two worlds." The room was quiet for several moments as the administrators processed this information. Sarah could see them trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, timid nurse they had known with the decorated combat veteran and potential federal consultant sitting in front of them. "What would that mean for your position here?" Dr. Webb asked. "I would maintain my nursing responsibilities at Mercy General, but I would also travel periodically to train medical personnel at other hospitals and military facilities. It would be a unique position that combines patient care with education and consultation." Patricia was looking at Sarah with something approaching awe. "6 months ago, you were afraid to speak up in team meetings. Now you're proposing to revolutionize trauma care training and work as a federal consultant." "6 months ago, I was trying to be someone I'm not," Sarah said simply. "It took almost losing someone important to me to realize that hiding from your own capabilities doesn't protect anyone. It just prevents you from helping people who need what you have to offer." Before anyone could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. Dr. Webb called for whoever it was to enter, and Agent Harrison stepped into the room, followed by a man in navy dress blues whom Sarah immediately recognized. "Admiral Peterson," Sarah said, standing immediately as the senior officer entered the room. Rear Admiral James Peterson had been Sarah's commanding officer during her final deployment, and his presence at Mercy General could only mean that her proposal had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez," Admiral Peterson said, returning her salute. "Or should I say, Ms. Martinez, since you're technically a civilian now." "Sarah is fine, sir," Sarah replied, gesturing for the Admiral to take a seat at the conference table. Admiral Peterson nodded to the hospital administrators before turning his attention back to Sarah. "I'm here because your recent activities have generated considerable interest in Washington. The successful completion of your mission, combined with your proposal for civilian trauma training, has led to some interesting conversations about how we can better integrate military medical expertise with civilian healthcare." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of excitement that she hadn't experienced since leaving active duty. "What kind of integration, sir?" "The Department of Defense is launching a new program to place experienced military medical personnel in civilian hospitals, creating a bridge between military and civilian trauma care," Admiral Peterson explained. "We need someone to lead this program, someone who understands both worlds and can navigate the cultural and operational differences between them." The offer was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for without realizing it. A way to use her military experience to help people while remaining in the civilian world she had chosen to embrace. The position would involve significant travel and responsibility, Admiral Peterson continued. "You would be establishing protocols, training personnel, and serving as a liaison between military and civilian medical communities. It's a ground-level opportunity to shape how we approach trauma care in the 21st century." Dr. Webb was looking back and forth between Sarah and Admiral Peterson with obvious excitement. "This would be incredible for Mercy General," he said. "Having someone of Sarah's caliber leading this kind of program with our hospital as the pilot site. Actually, Admiral Peterson said, we're hoping that Mercy General will serve as the primary training facility for the program. Your recent experiences with military-trained personnel, combined with Ms. Martinez's presence on staff, make this an ideal location for developing and testing new protocols. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her colleagues, seeing respect and excitement where once there had been dismissal and condescension. But, more importantly, she could see the possibilities that this opportunity represented. The chance to save lives on a scale she had never imagined, to bridge the gap between military and civilian medicine, to finally use all aspects of her training and experience in service of something larger than herself. I accept, Sarah said without hesitation. Admiral Peterson smiled. I hoped you would say that. Your first assignment is to develop a comprehensive training curriculum for civilian medical personnel, focusing on combat casualty care and mass casualty events. You'll have full support from both the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services. As the meeting broke up and arrangements were made for the new program, Sarah found herself alone in the conference room with Patricia Williams. Her former supervisor was looking at her with an expression that combined embarrassment, respect, and something approaching wonder. Sarah, Patricia said quietly, I owe you more than just an apology. I spent 3 months treating you like you were incompetent when you were actually one of the most qualified medical professionals I'd ever worked with. Sarah smiled, the first completely genuine smile she had allowed herself in months. Patricia, you treated me exactly the way I asked to be treated. I worked very hard to convince everyone that I was just an average nurse with no special skills or experience. But why? Why hide something so extraordinary? Sarah thought about the question for a moment before answering. Because for 8 years, my identity was completely defined by what I did in the military. I was Lieutenant Commander Martinez, combat medic, decorated veteran. I wanted to find out if there was anything left of Sarah underneath all that training and experience. And what did you find? I found that you can't separate who you are from what you've experienced, Sarah said. Trying to hide my military background wasn't protecting me from anything. It was preventing me from being the best version of myself. The skills I learned in combat, the confidence I developed under fire, the leadership abilities I gained through military service, those aren't burdens to be hidden. They're gifts to be shared. Patricia nodded, understanding dawning in her expression. And now you get to share those gifts on a national level. Now I get to save lives in a way I never imagined possible, Sarah corrected. Military medicine taught me how to work under impossible conditions, how to make life and death decisions under extreme stress, how to lead teams through chaotic situations. Civilian medicine has taught me how to connect with patients and families, how to provide comfort and care beyond just medical intervention, how to be part of a community rather than a military unit. Sarah gathered her papers and prepared to leave the conference room, but she paused at the door to look back at Patricia. The best part is that I don't have to choose anymore, she said. I don't have to be either Lieutenant Commander Martinez or Sarah, the civilian nurse. I get to be both, and together they're stronger than either one could be alone. As Sarah walked through the emergency department toward the nurse's station, where she would begin her new role as both staff nurse and trauma training coordinator, she was aware of her colleagues watching her with new respect and interest. The transformation was complete, not from one identity to another, but to an integration of all the aspects of herself that she had spent months trying to keep separate. Jennifer Chun, who had coined the nickname Mouse Martinez, approached her with obvious embarrassment and curiosity. Sarah, Jennifer said hesitantly, I wanted to apologize for the way we treated you before. We had no idea about your background. Sarah smiled warmly at the younger nurse. Jennifer, you don't need to apologize for anything. I worked very hard to make sure no one knew about my background. But now that we do know, Jennifer said, her voice taking on an eager tone, could you maybe teach us some of the things you learned in the military? I mean, if you're going to be running a training program anyway. Looking around the department, Sarah could see similar expressions of curiosity and eagerness on the faces of her colleagues. These were good people who wanted to be better at their jobs, who wanted to learn new skills that could help them save more lives and provide better care to their patients. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt truly at home. She had found a way to honor her service while embracing her civilian future, to use her combat experience to help people heal rather than to engage in warfare, to be both the warrior and the healer that her experiences had shaped her to become. "I'd be honored to teach you," Sarah said, meaning every word. "We'll start tomorrow with basic trauma assessment and combat casualty care protocols. By the time I'm finished with you, you'll be able to handle anything that comes through those doors." As Sarah settled into her new role, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had thought that leaving the military meant leaving behind everything she had learned and experienced during her 8 years of service. She had believed that becoming a civilian required abandoning the skills and confidence that had defined her military career. Instead, she had learned that true strength came not from hiding your capabilities, but from finding new ways to use them in service of others. The quiet nurse who had once been ridiculed for her timidity was gone forever, replaced by someone who had finally learned to integrate all aspects of her identity into a single, powerful whole. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, Navy SEAL combat medic, had found her way home at last. And in doing so, she had discovered that home wasn't a place or a position. It was the point where your abilities met the world's need for what you had to offer. The helicopter that had arrived for her 2 weeks earlier had carried her away from one life and toward another. But in the end, it had brought her exactly where she needed to be, standing in the middle of everything she was, ready to save lives in ways she had never imagined possible.